Biblical scholarship has often been described as detective work, and that's particularly relevant when it comes to Jeremiah's so-called Book of Consolation, chapters 30 to 31 of the text. As the world's greatest detective, I, Hercule Poirot, can discern a problem here, because the promise of a restored Davidic dynasty doesn't quite fit the gloom and doom pervading the book as a whole. I would argue that it was added later during the exile, representing an exilic, Deuteronomic perspective. Not surprisingly, there are additional issues when it comes to the text of Jeremiah. The nucleus of it is certainly found in the first 25 chapters, consisting of oracles against Judah and Jerusalem, lamentations and complaints. It's often called Jeremiah's Confessions. But might the original book have been so overwritten by exilic editors with their Deuteronomism that little, if anything, of the original Jeremiah remains? There's also a dispute over Jeremiah's attitude toward the reforms of Josiah. Was he fully supportive of those reforms, even though he strongly denounces their results? Did he think that those reforms were ill-conceived, or was he only responding to a post-Josiah regression to idolatry and waywardness? If Jerusalem was spared from Assyria in Isaiah's day under the righteous king Hezekiah, why is it destroyed following the righteous Josiah? Jeremiah's answer? Because Josiah's purge failed dismally. Vayomer Hashem Elai bimei Yoshiyahu HaMelech haraita asher asota meshuva Yisrael הולכה היא על כל הר גבוה, ואל תחת כל עץ רענן, ותזני שם, ואומר, אחרי עשותה את כל אלי, תשוב, ולא שבה, ותראה בגודה אחותה יהודה. Is the prophet condemning Josiah's reforms per se, or the fact that they were not accompanied by repentance? We can likewise ask, does Jeremiah denigrate the temple sacrifice, as Isaiah arguably did? Consider his famous sermon in the temple, where he denies that worship can deliver the people. כה אמר השם צבאות אלוהי ישראל, עולותיכם ספו על זבחיכם, ואכלו בשר, כי לא דיברתי את אבותיכם, ולא ציוויתם ביום הוציאי אותם מארץ מצרים, על דברי עולה וזבח, כי אם את הדבר הזה ציוויתי אותם לאמור, שמעו בקולי, והייתי לכם לאלוהים, ואתם תהיו לי לעם. והלכתם בכל הדרך אשר אצווה אתכם, למען ייטב לכם. He is even forbidden to pray for the people. ואתה אל תתפלל בעד העם הזה, ואל תישא באדם רינה ותפילה, ואל תפגע בי, כי אינני שומע אותך. By contrast, consider this passage which celebrates the temple sacrifices. ובאו מערי יהודה, ומסביבות ירושלים, ומארץ בנימין, ומן השפלה, ומן ההר, ומן הנגב, מביאים עולה וזבח, ומנחה ולבונה, ומביאי תודה בית השם. Is Jeremiah saying that upright behavior leading to social justice trumps religious ritual? Or do the moral sins he condemns stem directly from idolatry and from disrespecting kosher sacrifice? כי אם היטב תטיבו את דרכיכם ואת מעלליכם, אם עשו תעשו משפט בין איש ובין רעהו, גר, יתום ואלמנה לא תעשקו, ודם נקי אל תשפכו במקום הזה, ואחרי אלוהים אחרים לא תלכו, לרע לכם. ושיכנתי אתכם במקום הזה בארץ, אשר נתתי לאבותיכם, למין עולם ועד עולם. We should also mention the Rechabites, a sect known for refusing all wine. When Jeremiah brought them into the temple and offered them wine, they would not partake. הדבר אשר היה אל ירמיהו מאת השם, בימי יהויקים בן יאשיהו מלך יהודה, לאמור, הלוך אל בית הרחבים, ודיברת אותם, והביא אותם בית השם אל אחת הלשכות, והשקית אותם יין, ויאמרו, לא נשתה יין, כי יונדב בן רחב אבינו ציווה עלינו לאמור, לא תשתו יין, אתם ובניכם עד עולם. The prophet subsequently uses them as a model of a community showing faithfulness to its traditions. Another issue relates to the fact that significant portions of the book of Deuteronomy seem to dovetail with the text of Jeremiah. For example, Egypt is referred to as an iron furnace in both Jeremiah 11:4 and Deuteronomy 4:20. It's actually been speculated that Jeremiah himself or his famous scribe Baruch may have been the writer of the book of Deuteronomy, which was then ascribed backwards to Moses. We could even make a case that the so-called Deuteronomist was none other than Baruch ben Neriah. Then there's the fact that the Septuagint version of Jeremiah is 1/8 shorter than the traditional so-called Masoretic text we find in print today. Moreover, the Dead Sea Scrolls version of Jeremiah aligns with the shorter Septuagint version, leading us to believe that the original book was in fact somewhat shorter than what has come down to us. But let's return to consider a very famous unnamed suffering servant who appears in the second part of the book of Isaiah. נבזה וחדל אישים, איש מחובות וידוע חולי, וכמסתר פנים ממנו, נבזה ולא חשבנו, אכן חוליינו הוא נשא, ומחובנו סבלם, ואנחנו חשבנו הוא נגוע, מוכה אלוהים ומעונה, והוא מחולל מפשענו, מדוכא מעוונותינו, מוסר שלומנו עליו, ובחבורתו נרפא לנו. To many Christians, he's thought of as a prophetic image of Jesus of Nazareth. Many Jews think of the suffering servant as a symbolic representation of the corporate Israel, in other words, the Jewish people themselves. But there's also a fascinating theory that the suffering servant is none other than the prophet Jeremiah. It can also be argued that Jeremiah, in all of his suffering, did more than anyone else to preserve the Jewish people in the face of what might have been certain extinction. In point of fact, what normally happens to conquered people is that they die out. They are assimilated into the cultures of their conquerors, intermarrying and interbreeding until they no longer exist. The curious thing is that the Jews are the one people in human history who did not disappear. They simply would not assimilate. Someone had to provide the people a sufficient vision to promote their survival and to keep them intact. And quite possibly that someone was Jeremiah, who showed his people how to persevere in exile and overcome it. I might argue that Jeremiah is more universally misunderstood than any of the biblical prophets. He's thought of as a purveyor of gloom and doom, full of bitter and harsh harangues. To this day, a long, mournful complaint or lamentation, perhaps accompanied by a list of woes, is referred to as a Jeremiad. But contrary to this image, the case could be made that the real Jeremiah, far from being a passive messenger of misfortune, was a powerful social activist. His message, "We shall overcome someday." They would overcome through the monotheistic notion that there is a force beyond nature, which, having brought it into existence, continues to govern it through laws of justice and mercy. And that's the very foundation for social justice down to the present day. It can be counted that the biblical and prophetic descriptions of paganism were exaggerated, and that the polytheistic cultures of the ancient Near East were by no means as abominable as they are depicted. While often described as engaging in child sacrifice and ritual prostitution, little evidence has been uncovered to support such claims. Nonetheless, the pantheon of gods and goddesses that predominated in the region hardly provided a set of absolute values to which budding social justice warriors could appeal. To that extent, we can think of social justice movements as they exist today as being built on a foundation of ethical monotheism. And monotheism, which might not have survived at all had it not been for the prophet Jeremiah. It was he who had the insight to understand that paganism was fated for destruction. All through his life, he struggled against pagan idolatry. It was a losing battle, culminating in his very real suffering. But if we follow this argument, in losing the battle, he may well have won the war, because he gave his people, the Jews, a reason not only for surviving, but for overcoming the pain of exile and the next 2,500 years of suffering, persecution, and Holocaust. It's argued that the whole shape and character of post-biblical Judaism is indebted to Jeremiah more than any other Israelite. Abraham, of course, is thought of as the first Hebrew, but Jeremiah may be seen as the first Jew. In fact, we can't talk about Hebrews or Israelites as Jews until the exile in Babylonia. Hebrew, after all, is an ethnic term rooted in tribalism. When tribalism was strong, monotheism was weak, as attested by the constant backsliding of the people into paganism. The radical universality of Israel's God wasn't yet established. But when the land was conquered, when the tribal confederacy of old was no more, monotheism took hold, with Jeremiah as its chief cheerleader. Since their temple was destroyed, they had no identity left other than their monotheistic culture. It's then that they identify themselves as Judeans, Yehudim, Jews. And if we follow this argument, the one person who brought them to this place was Jeremiah. Thanks to him, there's an understanding that although the pagan deities vanish when their worshipers are conquered, the supreme monotheistic God of the universe never disappears. And because of the eternal covenant between this God and the Jewish people, they would never disappear either. Their existence and their perseverance is not bound up with political sovereignty. In fact, after Jeremiah's day, pagan and idolatrous practices are never again to be found on any substantial level among the Jewish people. Historically, it's a remarkable transformation. Long after Israel's conquerors vanish from the stage of history, the Jewish people still survive. It's not only their religious traditions, but the ethical practices of monotheism that become the glue that holds them together. All through history, whenever we find social justice movements on the march, we find Jews involved. And the rest is history.